Hello everyone, my name is Seamus. I've been asked by the tournament organisers to go through one of the topics that was done today. I believe it was the round one topic. And we're just going to break down some thoughts I have about the debate, some general ideas that would be included in each of the four teams. So the topic was, this House supports the privatisation of humanitarian intervention, e.g. the UN hires mercenaries and private military contractors for peacekeeping, or states hire mercenaries and PMCs to intervene in conflict. I have two observations about this debate from the get-go. The first observation I have is that this debate is actually about two kind of different things at the same time. Because the situations in which the UN might hire PMCs for humanitarian intervention are very different to the times in which states may hire PMCs to engage in humanitarian intervention. So, for instance, from the get-go, the US could frame intervening in Syria or Yemen or Libya or even Iraq in the first Gulf War as humanitarian interventions, maybe with varying degrees of success. And that's obviously very different because they are full conflict scenarios that are initiated on behalf of a state, compared to something like disaster relief. There's been a hurricane and we're trying to get humanitarian intervention in a place where we might use different tools, different means. We're trying to get aid to people. So this debate from the get-go is covering a very wide variety of different things. The second observation I have is that this debate is also going to be very characterization heavy. From the get-go, you can tell we're talking about whether or not certain groups are likely to be good at their job, whether or not they're likely to be ethical, moral, do things well. And my early instinct when I see a topic like this is, if you win that part of the debate, you are very likely to score well, because other parts of the debate are likely to be contingent upon that. Okay, let's start by talking about opening government, then we'll talk about opening opposition, and then we'll talk about some ideas in closing, though, as you'll see, that's going to be a little bit more brief, because usually some of the ideas at opening are likely to slide a little bit. Starting with opening government, I think there's a lot of work to do here in setup, and I would make sure that I did that work. The first thing to do is to observe that this is a support motion. So in support motions, we don't have fiat, we don't have resources, we don't get to explicitly model the way in which we think this would work. But what we do get to do is we do get to provide some sort of reasoning why we think it would work the way in which we want it to work, which is a slightly different thing, and we should maybe step through early why we think this will be done well. I think there are a few things to say here. The first thing I would do is I would point out what I alluded to earlier, which is that this is really a debate about two different types of situation. The first are situations in which the UN agrees, which usually would require a UN Security Council resolution, that some sort of humanitarian intervention is necessary. And what I would note about that is that these are usually not super controversial scenarios. They're scenarios in which the most powerful countries in the world have agreed, hey, we need to do something about this. So there's been a really terrible flood in Myanmar, or there's desperate need of some people to make sure that an election happens properly, or to quell civilian unrest in a state. That there might be just a few examples of what we're describing there. Then we have, like I prefaced earlier, a sort of different idea about state intervention in conflict. So this could also be a situation where, the US is invading a country and maybe they don't have Security Council sort of support or resolution, but we still have to support the privatization in those sorts of situations, assuming it's humanitarian intervention. And that begs, from the beginning of the debate, the very big question: what is humanitarian intervention? And I think the affirmative, or the opening government team and government teams in general, should push quite aggressively that their burden in this debate is really focused around humanitarian intervention. You don't want the sort of definition shift that could require you to support PMCs being used in other forms of conflict. So I would be very explicit that the primary purpose of the operation we're describing has to be humanitarian in nature. If there are ideas relating to sovereignty or to conquest or control of certain military objectives, then that would not qualify. And given you're supporting a trend, you don't have to support it in those instances. That does not mean that part of the debate might not prove messy for you. It's just clearly more strategic for you to really focus on what you think humanitarian conflict is and try to make that a little bit narrower, because if that gets broader, you may be in for some troubles in the debate a bit later. The second thing I would do is having noted that we're trying to focus the debate more on the other parts of it, is I'd step through a few other things. The first thing I'd point out is that the UN is historically extremely particular about the way in which it does its internal procedures, and that would likely extend also to the PMCs that it hired. So in the event that the UN is hiring a PMC to, say, go into the Rwandan genocide, they aren't going to hire a PMC that has a track record of abuse or genocide. They are very likely to monitor it to a very, very high degree. And I think that's probably something that would be accepted in a debate just if you said it, because that is, I think kind of common knowledge. But some good sort of touch points for this are the fact that other organs of the UN also have a lot of oversight and a lot of internal regulation. So like the International Criminal Court famously takes a very long time to deliver outcomes and to go through cases because they're really concerned with making sure they get the best outcomes with respect to justice. And that is very useful for you, right? Because you don't want the burden as opening government of having to defend terrible mercenary company going into a genocide. You really want to make sure that these companies look good as far as you're concerned. The third thing I'd say, and I'm not actually sure this is true, but I would certainly at least try and say that there are a wide variety of PMCs, that not all PMCs are evil. Sort of the classic evil one is called like BlackRock, I think, from memory. But there are others. One that I think a lot of people are aware of is G4S, which is one that recently has become a bit more of a normal security company. They've sort of tried to be a little bit more public facing, though they still have military operations. This is, I think, not something I would belabor. I would just point out that this is a pretty diverse market, that different states have different needs, and therefore it makes sense that there might be some who are a little bit more ethical and more moral. And I would also point out that it is very likely that they may become more so and relent to things like transparency requirements and accountability requirements if lucrative contracts were on offer, which sort of leads me to the fourth thing I would talk about. And this is a very common thing I would do in a lot of debates, both 3v3 and BP, is I would just emphasize we support this assuming it's done intelligently, which I think you have good reason to assume it would be. So we don't need to pass this policy today or support it today because it probably couldn't happen today. There probably aren't enough good PMCs for which this could actually work. But if the UN signaled their intention to do this and eventually there were PMCs that were sort of meeting the criteria that they described, then maybe that's a slightly different story. And at that point, this is something that they could support a little bit more. And then I think there's a sort of logical mechanism there, which is if the UN is offering contracts to PMCs to participate within their network, to sort of engage with the humanitarian conflicts they're trying to engage with, then presumably those PMCs may moderate and, as we've sort of discussed, become a little bit more palatable socially and in terms of their operations so that they can win those contracts. The final thing I'd point out is obviously that's a lot of setup. I do think that a lot of that setup is actually quite important and very useful to the government bench. And if I was Prime Minister, I would actually just point that out. And I would say explicitly, we probably deserve a bit of case credit for the fact that we are delivering a set of setup pieces that do make our side much more likely to win the long term against the other three teams in the debate. Don't belabor it. Don't, make it sound like you're God's gift to debating, but I think flagging that and that it has utility is useful. Having done that, I think then we sort of turn to consider a series of different axes in the debate. The first question I would ask is how this affects which conflicts are intervened in. And I would start by focusing on the United Nations level conflicts, and I would talk about why access to those conflicts increases. I think there are three broad mechanisms. I don't want to go into them in too much detail because that's not really the purpose of this video, but I think the first one is just that there is often a reluctance under the status quo for Security Council members to sign off on certain types of humanitarian intervention. So famously, Russia in particular, but also other states like China and the United States will veto even quite otherwise socially popular plans because of other sovereign interests, and often because of a fear that the other state might do something poor if they were intervening on their own behalf. What that looks like in practice is in the late noughties. I think it was 2010, but that could be wrong. It's 2011. I'm pretty sure it's 2011. Basically, the United States got Security Council clearance to do some work implementing a no-fly zone in Libya. And they also fired a few missiles that went above and beyond the mandate that they were given by the Security Council. And since then, Russia has basically said, we have a zero tolerance policy for the Security Council empowering the United States to do those sorts of military operations. The long story then is that they are much more likely to be willing if there was an actually cosmopolitan and palatable PMC who was both adequately trained but also not biased to one state or the other, then they would actually be more likely to support them. So the very, very long story short here is that you get rid of a state bias, and state bias is one of the reasons why these operations don't happen in the first place. The second thing is that this same sort of mechanism exists for host countries. So a very famous example of this is that in 2008, there was a cyclone in Myanmar, and it was terrible, massive humanitarian devastation, and the international community could not get anyone in there to assist or help because Myanmar was very concerned about foreign parties coming in. And I think you could, obviously, maybe that example specifically doesn't change a heap because Myanmar also didn't allow peacekeepers in, but I think it does serve your point that sometimes host countries will be much more aggressive to certain states entering. And it's easy to imagine a lot of, for instance, Middle Eastern states, which have a very tense relationship with the United States, given their history of invading the Middle East in the last 20 or 30 years, they may be more receptive to a truly cosmopolitan international force entering that did not have the baggage of being the United States military. What you might observe already about both of those things is they are both reliant and contingent upon a characterization of PMCs. And if you, therefore, you can see already that you need to prove that first part to sufficiency, which is that these PMCs are likely to be good. The third mechanism is also kind of similar, and that is just to say that there's actually a very small appetite for humanitarian interventions of some descriptions. So in particular, the worst ones, things like there is a genocide in Rwanda, and there was often very little political capital to engage in those conflicts, because often those conflicts don't affect developed countries that much because they're not geographically proximate to them. There's often not a lot of media coverage of them. And this was the famous dilemma with things like Rwanda. Noting as well that humanitarian intervention poses a lot of risks and costs to individual states who try to intervene. So in the event that, the United States goes into famously Somalia, which is documented in the movie Black Hawk Down, you can see that the outcome of that mission being botched was a terrible public relations campaign for the United States government at the time, the Clinton administration. So given that that was the case, there's this broad precedent, which is states really don't like to be the savior that much because there's a high degree of risk to them and not a lot of reward a lot of the time. That's a little bit different when it's a UN decision, because the UN has very active forefronted goals of promoting human rights and ensuring the safety and dignity of all people. So you could obviously have to explain that a little bit more, but I think that idea should carry. The impact of that then is that in a lot of the conflicts we're describing, assuming that the PMC is sufficiently both capable and ethically and morally palatable, it's likely to get into places that you otherwise would not have people. And that's actually a really big deal, right? Because it means that you get aid to people you would not have gotten aid to. It means that you can intervene and maybe stop or slow down a conflict that you otherwise could not. And so I think this is a first pathway to victory for the opening government team, but is notably reliant and contingent upon those characterization issues we've already discussed. I think the other part of this then is to maybe briefly discuss that characterization. We did a little bit of it in terms of setup, but I think the rest of it is just to sort of step through a little bit the incentives of PMCs, maybe in a little bit more detail. So I think there are some very obvious ones, the fact that they don't want negative international scrutiny, the fact that they want future contracts and therefore have a pecuniary sort of financial interest in these missions going well. I think they are almost sort of intuitive, but they are certainly worth saying and stepping through in a sufficient amount of detail that they get sticking power in the debate. The final thing I want to talk about opening government, because I don't want this video to go for too long and it's looking a bit long already, is just that this is a better form of humanitarian intervention. And I think there are a few kind of intuitive reasons for that. So first, that the status quo of other states trying to do things and then there is UN support is arguably suboptimal, and it would be better if the UN had a contractor that they were heavily integrated with. So, a PMC who is working very closely and consistently with them so that you don't have all of these short-term teething problems. Because one of the problems at the moment is that the UN has peacekeepers, and then those peacekeepers are sent into whatever country you want, Sierra Leone on short notice. They have to gel and adapt to the Sierra Leonean government and sort of situation, which is not very easy. Whereas in the situation in which instead of relying upon domestic support from the Sierra Leone government or foreign support from, say, the United States or France or whatever you want, those barriers are immediately reduced, and you could impact and describe why that's important. Second, you could talk about the development of things like specialization and the fact that they're very likely to get particularly good at the things that they're doing because they have more specific investment in those skills. I think there's a lot of ideas about oversight, transparency, and accountability, trying to make sure that the counterfactual there is not peacekeepers, but rather is foreign military forces. And then I think the last thing you can talk about is just like the development of trust and familiarity and reputation. So assuming that a PMC is consistently doing good work in these sorts of conflict zones, it is likely that they are more likely to succeed in the next one because the people are more likely to be receptive to them. So opening government at the end of that contributes to a characterization question, a very important characterization question, and then they affect two other sort of mechanisms in the debate, which is, do we get more or less access to humanitarian conflicts, and do we increase or decrease the quality of those conflicts? Let's talk about opening opposition. As I've sort of already alluded to, I think the main thing that opening opposition should do is really try and hit back on this characterization push, but they also should do some other things. So in terms of characterization push, I would try and make the claim, firstly, that almost all PMCs have very deep sort of systemic issues, and that is almost inherent because they get their personnel from former military officers, people who are hyper integrated into military culture. So it's unlikely that someone who's done 3 tours of Iraq is going to have the sort of cultural sensitivity in terms of the way they think about the Iraqi people that we would probably require from them. Also, just things like their mindset, the things that they prioritize, they're unlikely to be sort of compatible with the missions we're describing. Second, PMCs are literally designed to circumvent the rules of war and minimize state accountability. Third, PMCs sort of fundamentally have desires that are linked to profit. And that means that there's this weird incentive misalignment where PMCs are in a conflict zone and want that conflict to continue so they get more money, whereas we would probably prefer that they have the exact opposite incentive. And that's actually a kind of classic argument of privatization for state assets and things like that, but is also applicable here. That's actually not enough, though, because it's not enough to prove that PMCs are kind of bad at the moment. You also need to try and prove that PMCs will not change. And this requires a little bit more sophisticated analysis and is also something that CO can jump on if it's dropped by OO. And that is just to sort of explain in a little bit more detail the needs of the UN and the fact that these are likely to be extremely big missions. So the idea that the UN could somehow create a new PMC or organically lead to the creation of a new PMC that will accept their very large contracts seems unlikely. They're probably very likely to take existing PMCs who have a lot of the problems that they are describing. I think it's also worth noting that a lot of these contractors focus a lot of their resources on other things, like they're not going to be putting all of their work into the UN. They also have existing very lucrative contracts with the United States, Russia, China, etc. There are also a lot of other issues with PMCs. I think some very obvious ones, which are the things you probably thought of straight away when you saw this. They're not good at things like aid distribution, diplomacy, skills that we would like them to be good at. Decentralization can mean that they actually have less accountability because they are sort of, again, inherently not part of the UN, whereas the counterfactual of peacekeepers are literally still in-house as part of that organization. I think there's also just a few other practical questions here of like a conflict breaks out and, oh no, we need a PMC right now to get in there. in that very short window of time, it's maybe a little bit unrealistic that you have a PMC already on retainer who'd specialize in that form of conflict. And it's much more likely that you could train your own personnel, being peacekeepers or something like that, to be good in those sorts of situations. There's obviously a lot more to those. I don't want to sort of go into too much detail about that, but I think you're doing the sort of mirror of OG, and that's a little bit of how you can contest that characterization. Quickly then on some other ideas at OO, I think the first is you just rebut the idea about access. The first thing you do is I think you point out that it's contingent upon characterization, but also point out that there are a set of other reasons why access is probably not actually a good argument for opening government. The most obvious of which is probably that increased access is arguably bad. So if it is true that the US's attitude to humanitarian conflict is more, let's just send a PMC in, it maybe means they are more likely to intervene in humanitarian conflicts. And if we buy the idea that US intervention in humanitarian conflicts is often net negative, which is, I don't think, that difficult to prove, particularly when it's done by PMCs, then you might actually be able to flip this argument from opening government. Finally, I think you can also do some clever framing here, which is to point out that the barriers that the Security Council already has to signing off on interventions in these sorts of states are already extremely high, like we've already talked about with states like Syria. So it's unclear that this policy at its best would really be much of a tipping point. Like, the reason Russia vetoed resolutions to have humanitarian assistance in Syria wasn't because they didn't trust the US. It was more because they had a very close relationship with Bashar al-Assad. So maybe in some very specific situations, this might be a tipping point, but we're just mitigating that out of the debate a little bit. Finally, I think there are some interesting things about sort of the counterfactual, like peacekeepers during some conflicts are actually often sort of worse actually often very good. You can talk about some other ideas in terms of state intervention. You can talk about coalitions and why coalitions in some places, like in Iraq, have been very successful. Also, you could, I think, explain a little bit more mechanistically the mechanism of domestic state military support. So you go into Mali and the Mali government provides you with some sorts of assistance. As you can see, the opening half in this debate is almost guaranteed to be messy because a lot of setup needs to go into it. A lot of the characterization is a bit wishy-washy, and also the debate is engaging with a lot of different things at the same time. So for those reasons, really try to be the team that brings clarity, and I think you can also impact that. Let's then talk about closings. I think my big observation here is not to sound like a broken record, but deepening the main idea in the debate, which is the characterization of what these companies will look like, is going to be debate winning. And if your opening team slipped up a little bit and you can provide more concrete reasoning why if you're CG, why these PMCs will be good, and if you're CO, why they'll be bad, you're very likely to win the debate. That said, I think there are a few other things we can talk about in terms of other side, and I'll talk about them very briefly because some of them could be at opening, but it's a little bit messy when you go through a debate review like this. Quickly on closing government, I think there are 4 ideas that come to mind to me. The first is you could talk about minimizing conflict escalation. So to use an example of this very quickly, Russia blocks the US from going into Syria. The US goes into Syria anyway, and then Russia goes into both Syria and does a little bit of stuff in Yemen as well. And that arguably escalates conflict because you have this sort of proxy warfare where multiple states are intervening with things like drone strikes and airstrikes because there was not an acceptable middle ground in the first place. And so you could argue that this is actually a really nice tool to minimize sort of proxy warfare and minimize that sort of conflict escalation we've just described. Second, I think a very obvious argument is just potentially some idea about deterrence. I think you can step through in some degree of detail why it is that maybe states which are imposing humanitarian crises, assuming that you buy the premise that they're more likely to get access and intervention, are less likely, therefore, to do the bad things that lead to that intervention. Not a great argument because it's contingent on other parts of the debate, but it's certainly an idea. Third, I think there are some really interesting stuff at looking at the way in which this changes the PMC market. And this is maybe my favorite extension at CG, assuming you're not doing deepening stuff. And I think the basic idea here is just to approach PMCs as an economic market, step through the range of incentives they have and how they are likely to change. So I think there's some interesting stuff about how explaining why the UN contracts are going to be very big and very lucrative and therefore shape the incentives of these companies, and therefore why they have a very strong internal incentive to cut out the bad apples, to impose internal regulations, to increase transparency requirements, stuff like that. I think the final thing is maybe there's some stuff about why peacekeepers are actually just bad. There's been a few historical incidents with peacekeepers. They're often on sort of shorter term sort of rotations and don't have a lot of skills. Not the best because just not very high impact compared to some other ideas. CO. I think CO is maybe the hardest position in this debate, assuming not a lot of stuff slips through. There are a few ideas that I don't think are very good. So there are some ideas about alternative counterfactuals, which I think are arguably a knife I wouldn't run. There's an argument about a principle and how we maybe have a duty to intervene and it needs to be states responsible. Don't like that idea. It's just a little bit too wishy-washy, unclear why the intervention would have to be one way rather than the other. There's maybe some arguments about public mistrust and disenfranchisement, which are okay. So the idea of PMCs on the ground will be really bad for sort of state building and sort of public morale. Probably not going to be high enough impact to really shape the debate, but could have some value. I think the better stuff is about how this changes PMCs. And I would focus on how this leads to an increased militarization of PMCs. So if the US buys the premise tomorrow night that it can no longer intervene in humanitarian conflict and that it should let PMCs do it, it means that A, it's more likely that it funds and invests in its own PMCs, and B, that it gives them access to things like more advanced military hardware and stuff like that. And I think the rest of that argument sort of writes itself. And then I think a related argument then is the way in which this massively increases the power of PMCs, sort of socially, culturally, and actually directly strategically. Like it gives them way more power, way more bargaining power. It means therefore that in the event that they do things that are unscrupulous or bad, they have far less accountability, oversight. You can sort of run this argument, I think, in a fairly set of intuitive ways. That's gone a little bit longer than I planned. I'm sorry for that. They're my thoughts on the debate. Goodbye. Good luck for the rest of the tournament.